Tonight, we follow the life of a forward who seemed to arrive before his time. There are players who emerge gradually, who build through seasons, who accumulate slowly until the weight of their reputation becomes undeniable. And then there are players who simply appear, who step onto a pitch as though they had always belonged there, even when the world around them is not yet ready to receive them. Alexandre Pato was one of those players, a footballer whose gifts arrived ahead of schedule, whose brilliance surfaced before his body had fully caught up, before the structures around him had adjusted, before anyone had quite agreed on what he was supposed to be. He was the kind of player people remembered in images rather than in sequences. A moment of acceleration, a particular finish, the way he could receive the ball in a tight space and produce something clean, something final, in a fraction of the time anyone expected. But between those moments, there were gaps, long stretches of time where he was unavailable, or returning, or trying to recapture something that had already begun to feel more fragile than it once appeared. His career became shaped not by what he accumulated, but by what interrupted it, and by the enduring question of what might have been sustained if the conditions had simply been different. He was born on the 2nd of September, 1989, in Pato Branco, a city in the southern Brazilian state of Paraná. The name of the city, which translates roughly as White Duck, would become the origin of his nickname. He was not born into poverty, but neither was he born into comfort that removed all edge from his ambition. His family moved when he was young, settling in different parts of Brazil as the years progressed, and football became the constant. In Brazil, that is rarely unusual. Football is embedded in daily life in a way that makes it difficult to separate the sport from the culture that surrounds it. But even within that environment, certain children stand apart. They move differently on a pitch. They process the game at a pace that other children cannot match. Pato was one of those children. He joined the youth academy of Sport Club International in Porto Alegre when he was still young enough that serious professional football was only a theoretical concept. International were, and remain, one of the most significant clubs in Brazilian football. Their academy had a tradition of producing technically capable players, and the standards within it were genuinely demanding. Pato did not simply meet those standards. He moved through the age groups at a rate that required the club to consistently reassess where he belonged. The coaches who worked with him during those years described a player with natural finishing instinct, someone who did not need to overthink his decisions in front of goal. The instinct was already present. It simply needed context, experience, and physical development to express itself fully. He made his professional debut for International in 2006 at 16 years old. 16. In European football, that age would already be considered early for meaningful senior appearances. In Brazilian football, where the gap between youth and senior can be bridged by exceptional talent, it was still striking. He was not deployed as a novelty or a curiosity. He contributed. He scored. He demonstrated, in his early appearances, that the gap between what he could do in training and what he could produce in a competitive match was smaller than it had any right to be for a teenager. That gap, in most players, takes years to narrow. In Pato, it seemed almost absent from the beginning. International at that time were operating at a high level within Brazilian football and across the continent. The club had won the FIFA Club World Cup in 2006, defeating Barcelona in the final, and the environment around them was one of genuine confidence and ambition. Pato trained alongside senior professionals who had competed at the highest levels. He absorbed those environments quietly. He was not, by most accounts, a player who spoke loudly in dressing rooms. He was attentive. He watched. He seemed to understand, even at 16, that there was more to learn from proximity to experience than from any amount of isolated individual practice. The senior players around him responded to that quality. They treated him with the kind of respect that teenagers rarely receive in professional football, because he carried himself in a way that made seniority less relevant than it usually is. By the time 2007 arrived, his name had begun to travel. Brazil produces extraordinary talent with enough regularity that individual young players can sometimes get lost within the volume of what emerges. But Pato was distinct enough that European scouts had been watching him. The structure of international football transfers meant that his situation was complex. FIFA regulations at the time restricted the international transfer of players under 18, and those rules had been put in place for legitimate reasons. They were designed to protect young players from being moved across the world before they were physically, emotionally, and professionally mature enough to handle it. Pato was 17 when AC Milan began to formally pursue a deal for him. The solution that emerged was financially creative, but legally structured around the existing rules. Pato would technically be registered with a Brazilian club on loan, while Milan effectively acquired his rights, with his move to Italy becoming formally complete once he turned 18. AC Milan in 2007 was still one of the defining clubs in European football. They had won the Champions League in 2003 and 2007. Their squad contained players who were recognized across the world, men who had been central figures in international football for years. Carlo Ancelotti was the manager. The training ground at Milanello was a serious, professional environment with a culture of precision. Everything about it was calibrated for elite performance. The facilities were excellent. The staff were experienced. The expectations were clearly defined. And into this environment arrived a 17-year-old from Pato Branco who had played fewer than 50 senior professional matches. The first months were necessarily about adaptation. He was learning Italian. He was learning the rhythms of European training. He was adjusting to a different style of defending, to oppositions who pressed with more tactical organization than he had typically encountered in Brazil, to the physical intensity that characterizes even routine midweek training at a club of that level. His teammates were professionals who had spent careers developing their capacity to perform under the specific pressures of elite European football. For Pato, the learning curve was steep and constant, but his technical quality was immediately apparent to those around him. Kaká, who was at that time one of the most celebrated attacking players in the world, and already a Brazilian teammate of sorts in spirit and in international football, was generous with the younger player. The relationship between them was professionally supportive without being forced. Andriy Shevchenko had already left the club by this point, but the attacking lineage at Milan was well established. Ronaldinho would arrive later. The club understood forwards. They had the institutional knowledge to develop one. Pato's official debut for Milan arrived in December 2007 in the Club World Cup in Japan. Milan were participating as European champions, and the tournament gave him his first opportunity in official competition for the club. He scored in that tournament. He was 18 years and 4 months old. The occasion did not overwhelm him. Those who were present described a player who moved with the kind of assurance that seemed inconsistent with his age and experience. Not arrogance. Assurance. A physical confidence in his own body and in his own judgment that allowed him to perform without the visible anxiety that often accompanies debuts in high-stakes environments. When the Serie A season continued into 2008, Pato began to feature more regularly. His movement was sharp and direct. He had a low center of gravity that allowed him to change direction quickly, and his first touch was consistently reliable, even when receiving the ball under pressure. His acceleration over short distances was exceptional. Between 5 and 15 meters, he could create separation from defenders in a way that was genuinely disruptive. He did not simply rely on pace. He timed his runs with intelligence. He understood where space was likely to appear before it actually did, which is a quality that cannot be easily coached. Either a player senses the game that way, or they do not. He scored his first official Serie A goal for Milan in 2008. The season that followed was one of growing presence within the team. He was not yet a guaranteed starter. The squad around him was experienced and competitive, and a teenager earning regular minutes at a club of Milan's standing had to demonstrate consistent quality to hold his place. Pato did that often enough to establish himself as a genuine prospect in the eyes of the club, the fans, and the wider European football audience. The 2008 to 2009 season was his most significant early period at the club. He scored multiple times in the league, contributed in European competition, and began to develop the kind of on-pitch understanding with teammates that takes time to build. Kaká, in particular, seemed to bring out a focused directness in Pato's play. When they operated together in attacking positions, there was a fluency to the movement that felt natural rather than rehearsed. Pato would find pockets of space between the lines. Kaká would locate him with passes that required precise timing. The combination worked because both players operated with clarity of thought under pressure. There was no hesitation in the final third. They made decisions quickly, and they trusted each other to be in the positions that had been agreed. Ronaldinho arrived at Milan in the summer of 2008, and the presence of another Brazilian in the squad, and a player of that extraordinary distinction, changed the dynamic around Pato somewhat. Not negatively, but perceptibly. Ronaldinho was at a different stage of his career by that point. He was no longer the player who had seemed to transcend the normal limits of football at his peak at Barcelona. But he was still technically remarkable, still capable of producing moments that stopped people. Having him in training, observing his relationship with the ball, his comfort in tight spaces, his creative confidence, gave Pato another reference point for what the highest level of the game looked like when experienced from the inside. The training sessions at Milanello had a structure and a seriousness that Pato absorbed quietly. Each session had purpose. Recovery was taken seriously. The physical preparation of the squad was managed carefully, with staff monitoring load and workload across the week. For a young player, particularly one still developing physically, that environment offered both support and a certain kind of pressure. The support came from the quality of the staff and the resources available. The pressure came from the expectation that you would perform, that you would maintain your level, that you would continue to develop rather than plateau. Pato was physically maturing through this period. He had arrived as a teenager with the kind of lean, quick build that characterizes young attackers who rely on agility and instinct. As he moved through his early 20s, his physique changed. His body became more substantial. That process, which every young professional goes through, had particular implications for a player whose game depended so heavily on speed and rapid directional change. His qualities remained, his pace remained, but the relationship between his body and the physical demands of elite football was something that he had to continually manage. The first serious injury came during this period of development. The exact nature and timing of injuries can sometimes be simplified in hindsight into a single narrative moment, but the reality is usually more gradual. There are strains that limit training. There are matches missed that are not announced with any particular ceremony. There are periods where a player is present in the squad, but not fully fit, where they are training at reduced intensity, where the coaching staff are making careful decisions about what they can ask of a body that is not operating at its full capacity. For Pato, the injury cycle that would define so much of his career began, in various forms, Around 2009 and 2010, the 2009 to 10 season saw him miss significant time. The specific injuries varied, but the effect was consistent. He would return to form, score, demonstrate the qualities that had made him so exciting, and then miss another period. Each absence broke the rhythm that he had been building. In football, rhythm matters enormously for attacking players. The confidence that comes from regular match involvement, from consecutive performances where everything connects, is difficult to replicate through training alone. A striker who plays every week develops a sharpness in their decision-making, a trust in their own instincts, that fades during absence and has to be rebuilt upon return. For Pato, that rebuilding process became a recurring feature of his time at Milan. The 2010-11 season was in some respects his peak in terms of output. He scored regularly in Serie A, contributing enough goals to justify his presence in the starting lineup over an extended period. He was available more consistently during that season, and the effect on his play was visible. When he played without interruption, the quality was there. The goals came from different positions and through different actions. He scored with both feet. He converted one-on-ones with composure. He occasionally scored with his head, though that was never the primary dimension of his game. He was not a target striker who held the ball up and brought others into play. He was an attacker who needed to move, who needed to receive the ball already in motion, who needed space to accelerate into rather than static situations where he had to hold and link. The Brazilian national team was a natural extension of his club career, and he received significant international attention during this period. He was part of a generation of Brazilian players who were expected to carry the national team forward after a period of reconstruction following the 2006 World Cup. He made multiple appearances for the senior national team, scoring goals and featuring in prestigious tournaments. But the international career followed a similar pattern to his club career. Consistent presence was difficult to maintain. When available and in form, he demonstrated the quality that had always been evident, but the availability was never guaranteed. At Milan, the team around him was changing. Kaká left for Real Madrid in the summer of 2009, which altered the attacking dynamic considerably. The partnership that had worked so naturally between the two Brazilian players was no longer available to Pato on a weekly basis. He was now asked to produce in different combinations, to develop different kinds of understandings with different teammates. He adapted. He was a professional, and adaptation is part of what professionals do. But the loss of a particular creative relationship does affect an attacking player, even if it cannot be easily quantified. The 2011-12 season brought more disruption. Injuries returned with the persistence that had by now become familiar. Milan were evolving as a squad. Some of the major figures of the previous decade were departing or diminishing in influence. Younger players were being integrated. The tactical approach under new management required adjustments. Pato found himself in a squad that was transitioning, and his own physical difficulties meant that he could not contribute with the consistency needed to fully establish himself as the central attacking figure at the club. There were matches during this period where he returned from absence and immediately produced something exceptional. A goal in the first game back, a performance of genuine quality that reminded everyone present of exactly why the club had pursued him so aggressively in 2007. Those moments were real. They were not imagined or exaggerated in hindsight. The people who were in the stadium on those evenings, or who watched those matches on television, understood clearly that they were watching a player of unusual gifts. The problem was that those evenings were separated by stretches of unavailability, that prevented any accumulated momentum. The relationship between a footballer's body and the demands of elite competition is something that varies enormously between individuals. Some players can absorb extraordinary physical loads across entire careers with minimal interruption. Others, through a combination of physical structure, injury history, and the particular demands of their playing style, find that maintaining full fitness is a continuous challenge. Pato fell into the second category. His playing style was physically intensive. He accelerated hard. He changed direction sharply. He received physical contact from defenders who were aware of the threat he posed and who were prepared to apply pressure to slow him down. Each of those actions places demand on the muscular and structural systems of the body, and over time, those demands accumulated. He was not by any measure a player who lacked professional discipline or who treated his own physical preparation carelessly. The staff at Milan were too experienced and the culture too serious for that. He worked through rehabilitation periods with the commitment expected of a player at that level. But rehabilitation is not the same as performance. You can be fully committed to a recovery process and still find that, when you return to competitive football, the body requires further time before it operates with the automaticity and confidence that match performance demands. By 2012, the question of his future at Milan had become a genuine uncertainty rather than a theoretical consideration. The club had signed significant players. The squad had depth in attacking positions. Pato's injury record meant that his reliability was questioned, not his talent. The distinction matters. The talent was never in doubt among those who had watched him consistently. What the club needed from him was availability, and that was the one thing he had been unable to guarantee. He returned to Brazil on loan in early 2013, joining Corinthians. The loan represented a practical attempt to restore his match sharpness in a more familiar environment. Playing in Brazil, in a culture and a football context that he had grown up within, offered the possibility of rediscovering the kind of fluid, confident rhythm that Serie A had interrupted, with its relentless demands and its physically taxing schedule. Corinthians in 2012 and 2013 were a strong side. They had won the FIFA Club World Cup in 2012, defeating Chelsea in the final. The club operated with ambition, and they had supporters who filled the Pacaembu, and later the new Arena Corinthians, with genuine passion. Playing in that environment, in front of Brazilian crowds who understood and appreciated the kind of football he could produce, was different from performing in European stadiums, where the tactical understanding of the supporters was filtered through a different cultural lens. He played regularly for Corinthians and contributed meaningfully, but the time away from Milan also raised questions about whether a permanent return to European football was the right path. The loan was finite, and when it concluded, the situation required resolution. Milan had not given up entirely on the idea of a future with Pato, but the circumstances made a straightforward continuation unlikely. He moved permanently to São Paulo FC in 2013. It was a significant club, one of the most supported in Brazil, with a history of producing and developing attacking players. The move was intended to represent a fresh chapter, free of the particular pressures of European football, of the weight of expectation that had followed him from Milan. Pato could find consistent minutes, consistent performance, and the opportunity to rebuild something like the form that had once made him one of the most exciting young players in world football. The São Paulo period was mixed. He performed at times with real quality, and the club gave him space to develop his game in an environment that was demanding, but not oppressive in the way that elite European competition can be. The Brazilian league required a different kind of attention. The physical environment was different. Travel within Brazil could be demanding. The schedule required adaptability, but the core quality of his play, when he was available, remained evident. Chelsea made a loan move for him in January 2016, which represented a return to European football that few had anticipated by that stage of his career. The move to England was an unusual proposition. The Premier League at that time was operating at a ferocious intensity. The physical demands were significant, even for players who had spent years adapting to them. For a player returning to European competition after time in Brazil, the adjustment period would need to be carefully managed. Guus Hiddink was managing Chelsea at that point, and the idea of having Pato available as an attacking option had appeal. Chelsea were in a difficult spell in their league campaign, and bringing in a player with his technical background offered a different dimension. But the reality of the loan period was more complicated than the optimism that surrounded its announcement. He made only a handful of appearances for the club. The minutes he received were limited. The environment at Chelsea in that particular period was unsettled, and integrating a new player on a short-term loan into that unsettled environment was always going to be difficult. He did not establish himself during the Chelsea loan. The brief episode became another example of the gap between what he was capable of and what circumstances allowed him to consistently produce. The loan concluded, and he returned to São Paulo before moving on again. His move to China followed. Tianjin Quanjian in the Chinese Super League was a club investing heavily in international players during that period. The league had attracted significant names from European and South American football, motivated by salaries that exceeded what was available in most other competitions. For Pato, the move to China was at one level practical. The financial security it offered was real. The competition was less intense than European football at its highest level. The physical demands were different. Playing in China presented its own adjustments. The tactical structure of the Chinese Super League was variable. Some clubs were well organized and professionally managed. Others were less so. The quality of opposition was lower than what he had encountered at AC Milan or in the Brazilian league at its best. But the environment allowed him to play regularly, to maintain match fitness, without the injury interruptions that had defined his European period. The Chinese football project was ambitious and resource-heavy, but the structures supporting the league were not always as stable as the investment suggested. Clubs spent enormously on player wages, but the underlying football infrastructure was still developing. Training facilities, medical support, tactical sophistication at the coaching level, all of these varied considerably from club to club. Pato found himself in an environment that was different from anything he had previously experienced, and the adjustment, professionally and personally, required genuine effort. Orlando City in Major League Soccer followed, providing another environment and another chapter. MLS during this period was growing in profile, but remained a league of considerable variation in quality and organization. Some clubs in the league operated with serious professionalism and genuine tactical intent. Others were at an earlier stage of development. The league attracted players who were either in the late stages of distinguished careers or who were using MLS as a bridge between other situations. Playing in America offered different experiences again. The cities were large. The support for football, as distinct from other American sports, was variable across different markets. Orlando had a growing supporter base, and the club had begun to establish itself within the league. But the transition from South American and European football to MLS required reorientation. The tactical ideas were different. The pace of the game was different. The physical demands were substantial, but expressed through different pressures than those of Serie A or the Brazilian Serie A. He did not remain in MLS for an extended period. The subsequent move to Villarreal in Spain was brief, representing a short-term opportunity to return to European football in a league of genuine quality. Villarreal at that point were an established La Liga club with a clear philosophy and a well-organized squad. The move suggested that his technical quality was still valued at a European level, that the work of maintaining his fitness and his form had produced something worth considering. But the time at the Spanish club was limited in duration, and he did not accumulate the appearances that might have produced lasting impact on his reputation within that context. Returning to Brazil marked the later stage of his career. After the various moves through different leagues and different environments, being back in Brazilian football carried a particular significance. The country where he had developed, where his talent had first been identified and nurtured, was also the place where the pressures and the history of his career were most keenly felt. Brazilian football supporters had watched his trajectory with a mixture of admiration and something more complicated. The admiration was for the quality he had clearly possessed. The complicated feeling was for everything that had not been sustained. The expectation that follows a player who was identified as exceptional at 17 does not diminish easily. In Brazil, where football is discussed with a seriousness and a depth of knowledge that few cultures can match, the gap between what Pato had seemed to promise and what his career had delivered was a topic that generated genuine reflection. Not hostility, reflection. The supporters understood that injury was not a character failing. They understood that circumstances shape careers in ways that individual effort cannot always overcome. But understanding a situation intellectually does not prevent a certain sadness at the distance between possibility and reality. What made him the kind of player people remembered was specific. It was not simply pace, though his pace was exceptional in his prime years. It was the combination of pace with technical precision. He could accelerate into a position and still produce a technically demanding finish without any disruption in his movement. The connection between physical action and technical output was seamless in a way that made watching him at his best genuinely pleasurable. A player who has only pace is useful in a limited way. A player who has pace and the technical quality to convert what that pace creates is something rarer. His finishing was instinctive rather than calculated. The best finishers in football do not stop in front of goal to assess the situation with the deliberate attention that coaches sometimes encourage in training. They read the ball's arrival. They feel the position of the goalkeeper. They make the decision before the conscious mind has fully processed all the available information. It happens faster than that. It operates through a kind of embodied knowledge that is developed over thousands of repetitions in training, but expressed in matches as something that looks spontaneous and effortless. Pato had that quality. When he was available and in rhythm, the goals he scored carried the quality of that instinctive execution. The people who played alongside him during his best period at Milan have spoken over the years with consistent respect about what he brought to the squad. He was not a player who demanded attention or who needed to be the organizing center of everything around him. He was a player who, within the right structure, created threats that altered how the opposition had to defend. When defenders are aware that a particular player can accelerate past them and finish with the quality Pato possessed, they adjust their positioning to account for that threat. That adjustment creates space elsewhere. His presence alone had tactical implications that benefited his teammates, even on days when he did not score. The conversation about what his career might have been is one that surfaces whenever his name is mentioned in serious football discussion. It is a conversation that runs the risk of unfairness if handled carelessly. Comparing a career interrupted by injury to a hypothetical, uninterrupted version is not a simple exercise. We cannot know with certainty that a version of Pato, who remained fully fit throughout his time at Milan, would have become one of the defining strikers of his generation. The game is too complex for that kind of certainty. What we can say is that the capacity was there. The elements that make a great forward were present in his game in sufficient quantity that the question is reasonable. He played in the 2010 FIFA World Cup in South Africa as part of a Brazil squad that had enormous expectations placed upon it. The tournament did not go as hoped for Brazil, who were eliminated in the quarter-finals by the Netherlands. Pato featured as part of the squad, though not as a dominant central figure within the team's campaign. The experience of a World Cup, even one that ends in disappointment, shapes a player's understanding of what the game means at its most significant scale. The atmosphere of those tournaments, the weight of national expectation, the concentration of the world's attention on each individual match is unlike anything experienced in club football, even at the highest level. Throughout the different phases of his career, the qualities that had defined him remained recognizable, even when the circumstances around him changed. He was always capable of producing moments of genuine quality when he was fit and in form. The finishing instinct did not disappear with age or with movement between different leagues and environments. What varied was the consistency of the platform available to him. When he had regular minutes, regular training, regular involvement in a settled squad with clear tactical structure, the quality appeared. When those conditions were absent or interrupted, the output was predictably less reliable. The comparison to other Brazilian forwards of his generation is instructive without being reductive. Brazil produced many attacking players during the period when Pato was at his peak. Some of those players built careers of remarkable, sustained excellence. Others followed paths that were more fragmented. The difference between the two outcomes was rarely a simple matter of talent or dedication. Context, luck, physical resilience, and the particular demands of the clubs and leagues in which players operated all contributed to the final shape of a career. Pato's career was shaped by these forces in a particular way that produced what it produced. The clubs he moved between after leaving Milan represented genuine opportunities at each stage. Some were seized more fully than others. Some were limited by circumstances outside his control. At no point in his career did he appear to be a player who had stopped caring about the qualities of his performance, or who had accepted mediocrity as a reasonable outcome. The engagement with the work was always present. The professional commitment was visible in the manner in which he returned from injuries, in the manner in which he adapted to different environments, in the manner in which he continued to produce meaningful football long after the peak years at Milan had passed. The Italian football public retained a particular warmth for him throughout the years that followed his time at Milan. Italy is a country where football memory is long and where genuine appreciation for technical quality tends to persist. The supporters at the San Siro, who had watched him during those early seasons, who had seen the goals and the performances and the electricity of a very young Brazilian forward at one of the world's great clubs, held those memories with the kind of affection that only certain players earn. He had given them something real. The fragility of what followed did not retroactively diminish what he had produced while he was there. His influence on younger players in Brazil, particularly those who went through the same process of early identification and rapid development, was sometimes discussed in terms of what his experience revealed about how young talent should be managed. The question of when to move a teenage player to European football, how to support them through that transition, how to protect the physical development of a body, still maturing, while extracting the maximum competitive benefit from exceptional talent, is one that football continues to engage with. His trajectory contributed to that ongoing conversation in football's administrative and sporting circles, even if the conversation rarely referenced him directly. The training environments he passed through across his career were genuinely varied. From the serious, highly structured approach at Milanello, where every element of preparation was considered and intentional, to the different cultures of Brazilian clubs and the varying standards of Chinese and American football, he adapted his professional habits to what each environment required and offered. That adaptability was a quality in itself. It did not always produce the conditions for his best football, but it demonstrated a practical professionalism that went beyond the simple expression of talent. What settled around him over time, as the career moved through its different chapters, was a particular kind of reputation. He was the talented player who had arrived very early, who had produced at the highest level when very young, whose career had been interrupted by physical difficulties that no amount of dedication could fully overcome, who had moved through different footballing cultures without losing the essential quality of his game, who remained, in the minds of those who had watched him during his peak, a player of genuine distinction. The questions that sometimes surrounded him about resilience or consistency were answered, in a sense, simply by the longevity of his career. A player without genuine professionalism does not continue to compete across different leagues and environments for the period that he did. A player without genuine quality does not continue to be sought by clubs, even at different levels than the very highest, across as many years as his career spanned. The career was not the career it might have been, but it was a real career, played by a real player with real gifts. There is something particular about the early years at Milan that stays in the minds of those who followed him through that period. It was not just the goals, though the goals were good. It was the ease of it, the way he seemed in those first seasons to be playing within himself rather than at the absolute limit of what he could produce. That sensation of watching a player operate with a margin of undisclosed capacity is rare, and it is arresting. It creates in the observer a conviction that more is available whenever the situation truly demands it. For Pato in those early years, that conviction was entirely justified. The question that his career posed, and that the interruptions made impossible to definitively answer, was how high that ceiling actually sat. The Brazilian context of his career provides one final dimension worth considering. He grew up in a football culture of enormous richness, but also enormous pressure. Brazil expects its best players to be extraordinary in a specific way. The country has produced so many players of world class that the bar for what constitutes genuine distinction is set very high. Within that context, being identified as a major talent in your mid-teens and being sent to AC Milan before you are 18 represents a specific kind of pressure. The expectations attached to that journey are not small. The gap between those expectations and the reality of a career interrupted by injury is a gap that can only be fully understood by the player who lives it. A forward who did not always follow a straight path, but who left behind flashes that remained clear long after they passed. A career that moved in fragments, yet never lost its sense of possibility. The pace slows. The noise fades. And as the moments settle, the night follows. Good night.